So last week I saw 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, and I am so blown away. This movie is amazing. And it's not just the fact that it's so wildly entertaining and unfiltered. It's more because it's so incredibly rich with commentary on philosophy, history, war, religion, and human nature. And in this video, I want to break down every single symbol, theme, reference, character philosophy, and major scene. And of course, the ending and epilogue of the film, as well as how Bone Temple connects thematically with the greater 28 Days film series as a whole. So as I usually do, I've done plenty of research on the original creators, the new collaborators, the behind-the-scenes production, and the many references to world history and popular culture. So to break this movie down, we're going to use three themes. One, Contagion of Rage. We'll discuss the original 28 Days Later, the symbolism of the virus, the major themes of the franchise, and the franchise's major influences. Two, Dangers of Tradition. We'll discuss the reason for the new 28 Years Later trilogy, the thematic relationship between 28 Years and Bone Temple, a comparison between Jamie, Dr. Coulson, and Jimmy Crystal, and the character of Spike. And three, the biggest theme, Memento Mori, where we'll discuss Coulson's philosophy, Coulson's relationship with the infected, the meaning of Memento Mori, the Duran Duran song, Samson's medical treatment, the abandoned train scene, Jimmy Crystal's philosophy, the references in Jimmy's image, Jimmy's real father, the conversation between Jimmy and Coulson, Jimmy Ink's character, the symbolism in the final Iron Maiden performance, and the ending with the inverted crucifixion, and the epilogue about World War II with Cillian Murphy's gym, and so much more. Hope you enjoy. Theme number one, Contagion of Rage. So, for me to best analyze 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, I need to start at its very roots, narratively and thematically, with the very first film in the series, 28 Days Later, from 2002. So the origins of this story all begin within the minds of director Danny Boyle and screenwriter Alex Garland. And I want to begin with Alex Garland, where the idea of the infected began. Back in the late 90s, Garland found himself obsessed with the 1996 survival zombie horror game Resident Evil on the original PlayStation. But the one concern he had with the game was the zombies moved a little too slowly. They felt sort of unthreatening at times. However, he did notice the zombie dogs in the game moved much quicker and would startle him as they burst through windows and chase you down. Garland thought, what if there was a film where they gave that same speed and element of surprise to the zombies themselves? And that was the inception of the concept for 28 Days Later. However, if anyone is familiar with Alex Garland and has seen his work in film like Men, Civil War, and Ex Machina, you very well know any creation of his will not come without some deeply integrated social commentary. So, for the thematic inspiration, Alex had two major influences: the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead and the 1951 novel The Day of the Triffids. And I want to talk about both of those influences because both of them provide such a good thematic foundation for what Alex Garland is trying to tell us with this 28 Days film series as a whole. In Night of the Living Dead, the premise is incredibly simple. A group of strangers barricade themselves in a farmhouse while the dead inexplicably rise and attack the living. And the ultra simplicity of that premise allows the film to focus on the behaviors of humanity when under pressure and desperate for survival. And as the film explores its own story and characters, we learn something about the real world that's very frightening. Civilization and social order is fragile. In other words, the moral values of humanity will collapse when people feel scared. This is an idea we see very directly in the first film, where our figures of leadership and order, the soldiers, become the main antagonists of the film, losing their morality, abusing their power, and becoming bigger antagonists than the infected themselves. Very similarly, we see it in the way the Jimmies are able to so easily recruit new members that were originally their opposers in 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. And we'll dive a lot deeper into the Jimmies much later in this video. So the second major influence for Garland, The Day of the Triffids, has a much more peculiar premise than Night of the Living Dead. In this story, a spectacular meteor shower permanently blinds the majority of the human population. Meanwhile, a deadly plant species called the Triffids rises to become the dominant species on Earth. And with such a unique concept, author John Wyndham could explore how humans prioritize and value one another based on capability and wellness. Are we meant to help those in need? Or are we meant to leave them behind as a necessary process of human evolution and prosperity as a species? And this is an even more prevalent idea in Bone Temple, as we see that question proposed on screen, with Dr. Kelson representing the side of helping others in need, and Jimmy Crystal representing the side of dominating others by means of survival, progress, and purpose. And as said before, we'll dive much deeper into this dynamic later on in this video. But ultimately, to tie these two inspirations together, it's so much more about the human beings than it is about the zombies, the infected. It's the message that we are our own worst enemies, and at the heart of every one of our greatest tragedies is the deepest and darkest form of our own evil as humans. And very poetically, that idea of evil is exactly what Alex Garland and Danny Boyle wanted the virus to represent. As Boyle describes in the production notes, the idea of the psychological virus felt completely contemporary. Rather than being a physical infection, the virus taps into the modern phenomenon of social rage. The virus represents our deepest form of rage. Rage stemming from our darkest feelings: hatred, resentment, discontent, insecurity, victimization. And when such rage is felt and lashed out onto other human beings, they develop a counter sense of hatred, resentment, discontent, insecurity, and victimization, eventually spreading across our communities and planet like a viral infection, inevitably growing into some of the most destructive forms of evil in history, ending in atrocities and disasters across the world that look frighteningly similar to the world of 28 Days Later. Theme number 2, dangers of tradition. So once that 28 Days Later film finally came out, as you likely know, it was a tremendous critical, financial, and cultural success, starting a cinematic revival of the zombie horror genre, with films like Shaun of the Dead, Black Sheep, and I Am Legend going into production very soon after, as well as the 2007 sequel 28 Weeks Later. However, 28 Weeks Later doesn't really fit very well into the continuity of the rest of the film series, and even thematically I feel like it doesn't fit very well as well. And more importantly, Garland isn't a fan. He didn't write the film, and as he claims, the studio who owned the rights at the time was just very eager to release a sequel to make money off of the property. So for those reasons that he described, I'll be ignoring that film for this analysis. Which brings us forward about 18 years to the next film in the series, 28 Years Later. The first film in a new trilogy back in the hands of Alex Garland and Danny Boyle. Fortunately, at this point in time, the two of them finally got the rights back to the property, now having full creative control over the project to make a trilogy that truly aligns with the ideas and philosophy of the original 28 Days. And Garland describes how this new 28 Years Later trilogy builds on that first 28 Days film narratively and thematically. What 28 Years Later most belongs to is 28 Days Later, because the conditions within the film are dictated by the first one. And most of the story and the themes are a product of thinking about what would happen if 28 years had passed. And some of that would be logical, like the infected themselves. They're not supernatural, they're not reanimated dead people, they're sick people who have an infection and they need to eat, they need to drink. And then from that, I think the film became concerned with the products of the passage of time. So communities, belief systems. What is it to look back and remember? What is it to look back and misremember? Or look back and forget? So in Alex's quote, he's saying that the 28 Years films build off of that initial 28 Days film in two specific ways. In one way, the mutation and evolution of the virus. Now, not only creating your standard infected, but then also the chubby, slow-low infected, eating worms out of the ground. And then the alpha with an increased level of strength and size who takes a leadership role among its group. And in the second way, more importantly, the belief systems that have emerged through the new communities that have developed since the outbreak. And so far, in 28 years in Bone Temple, we've seen 3 separate belief systems established through 3 separate characters: Jamie, Jimmy, and Kelson. And it's those 3 belief systems that are essentially the central philosophical discussion of these 28 Years Later films. So first, out of the 3, I want to start with Jamie's philosophy. So Jamie's philosophy is a major focus of 28 Years Later. It's all about the pitfalls of nostalgia and the stagnation of traditionalism. And I want to pull another quote from Garland to further break down that social commentary that he was making with that character of Jamie. It's not, say, COVID or Brexit. It was more to do with the regressive state over the last 10 to 15 years, where there's a real preoccupation related to looking backwards, how things used to be trying to make things great again or recover a state of glorious sovereignty. And I think that the feature of that is in part that it's regressive. It's not looking forward to build in a way, it's looking back to recapture. And I think the features tend to be cherry-picked memories and amnesia about some things. And I'm sure as you've seen that first 28 years later film, you've surely seen some very clear examples of traditionalism on Jamie's Island. The pictures of the Queen, their outdated technology and villager roles, and their almost ceremonial practice of having a party across the community to celebrate a boy's first kill in the wild. But the real metaphor in the danger of tradition is Jamie's attitude toward the infected. And I'll use one more quote from Garland to break this metaphor down. You look at the way Jamie reacts to the infected. He talks about how it's okay to kill them. And in fact, it's good to kill them. And you need to learn how to do it. And don't worry about killing them because they don't have souls, which is like saying they're subhuman in a sense. And then the way Dr. Kelson reacts to them, where he sees them really completely differently. And he's not really differentiating between infected and non-infected people. Both Jamie and Kelson have an encounter with an infected. And Kelson deals with the infected in a completely different way. So in that quote, Garland is juxtaposing the closed-mindedness and superiority complex of Jamie against the open-mindedness and humility of Kelson. And that comparison clarifies that that first 28 years later film is a commentary on how strict traditionalism and selective nostalgia can actually hold a people back and actually devolve them culturally and socially. We see it in many political leaders today and the citizens that they influence. And I'm sure that's what Garland had in mind when he was writing this film. And to further amplify that metaphor, director Danny Boyle in that same interview highlighted how the children are taught selective history about England with gender-specific roles, and the children are conditioned to view the infected as the enemy through storytelling and imagery, like the recurring symbol of the bloody eye masks that the children are trained to shoot again and again in training. But of course, that first 28 years film certainly isn't a cynical one. It's a hopeful one, largely because of its main protagonist, Spike. Spike represents the courageous defiance of tradition in search of a better future. He doesn't see the infected in the way his father does, and isn't interested in the selective storytelling he sees his dad fabricating at the party after their hunt. And unlike his father, he envisions a future for his mother. And even when his mother's life does meet its end, she's remembered with the highest form of respect, regardless of her mental wellness and ability. And it's through Isla's instincts of motherhood that a new life and ray of hope for the future is born. And this thematic commentary ties in so well with that very early inspiration we spoke about earlier in the video, The Day of the Triffids, where author John Wyndham discusses whether we ignore and evolve past the disabled and unwell, or we acknowledge them as equals for them to show us strengths we couldn't even see in ourselves. And the latter is exactly what Dr. Kelson exemplifies. So let's discuss what our next two characters out of the three represent. In theme number 3, Memento Mori. So to continue Garland's comparison between Jamie and Kelson, let's move on now to Kelson. So while Jamie sees the infected as inhuman and a subspecies existing beneath his own, Kelson, as Garland explained earlier, sees the infected very differently. He sees the infected as one of his own, human beings who are merely sick. Therefore, while Jamie is unafraid to kill infected countlessly, Kelson would never take a life of even one. And Kelson treats them with the utmost respect. When he encounters the Alpha, he names him Samson for his size, strength, and hair. And he handles Samson like a patient, not a test subject, studying him trustingly, conversing with him, and even dancing with him. Kelson understands the value of life, his own and everyone else's. It's literally his mantra, Memento Mori. As director Nia DaCosta explains, I think the 28 years later franchise is incredibly existential, and is particularly represented through Kelson with Memento Mori, Memento Amoris. Remember you must die, remember you must love. Those are the fundamentals of life, really, because everything else we've just made up. And it's through Nia DaCosta's particularly softer and more patient style of directing that we clearly see and understand the level of humanity within Kelson, which keeps him so grounded in such solitude, where he pins up pictures of his family before the outbreak, studies his medical books in a persistent search for a cure, and plays his favorite pop songs. Duran Duran's Girls on Film, Rio, and Ordinary World, all songs with underlying themes of escaping superficial, shallow delusions and grounding oneself in the harsh truth of reality, very subtly reflecting the difference between Kelson and Jimmy Crystal. And of course, Kelson's bone temple is the ultimate symbol of respect for the lives lost, regardless of infection. And the message of Kelson's philosophy is carried through quite beautifully in his relationship and story arc with Samson. Kelson spends time with Samson as a patient of his to see if his humanity is recoverable. He wonders if there's a form of psychosis in the virus, triggering Samson to inevitably see the uninfected humans as some kind of threat. And we as an audience know this to be true, because earlier in the film, we see through Samson's eyes, an uninfected man's face suddenly turns to this aggressive wild beast. And when Kelson's running out of morphine to silence Samson's pain and subdue his aggression, he decides to euthanize Samson, knowing it would end all of the severe internal suffering. But when he asks Samson for any kind of consent, Samson says, "Moon," which confirms that Kelson's treatment was working and opens up the door to a possible cure. So later in the film, when Kelson is worried for his own life after Jimmy Crystal's visit and threat, he gives Samson a substantial dose of antipsychotics in the hope that it can treat him effectively. So the next day, after the treatment, Samson walks into an abandoned train, which is one of the most pivotal scenes in the film series yet. So Samson, sitting on that train seat, triggers a childhood memory where he's looking at a book about space on a page about the moon, explaining why he said moon earlier in the film. And in that same memory sequence, he turns to his adult self before his infection, as if he's still on the train speaking to the attendant. And just as he's snapping out of the memory sequence, he says, as his real current self, "I don't have a ticket," with complete clarity, confirming that Kelson's theory was correct and the infection is treatable. And to even further prove this, when Samson completely snaps out of the memory sequence, all the infected who have found him on the train attack him as if he isn't infected at all. So now that I've spoken quite a bit about the philosophy of Jamie, and now Kelson, why don't we move on to the third philosophical figure, Jimmy Crystal. So, as Garland described earlier, the purpose of this whole return to the 28 Days Later franchise is to explore how new belief systems and communities could emerge and shape the new world after social order has essentially been destroyed. How will you decide to shape the new world in front of you? So of course, on the most humane and virtuous side of the spectrum, Kelson believes in the preciousness of life in all forms. Somewhere else along the spectrum, we have Jamie, whose hyper-traditionalism gives him a superiority complex, but he was raised with enough community to give him a solid, grounded moral code. But on the far other end of the spectrum, we have Jimmy Crystal, where any sense of community he might have had was massacred directly in front of him. As we see at the beginning of 28 Years, Jimmy's family and friends are all murdered by the infected right in front of him. And therefore, the social order that he creates is this darkly distorted idea of purpose. His only conceivable way of navigating a world evil enough to punish him so cruelly for no good reason. And Nia DaCosta and Jack O'Connell described this concept in their interview with Mashable. I think because we do meet Jimmy as a kid and we see the horrific trauma that's brought on him very young, it kind of did give a little bit more license and a bit of a reason why. I mean, Jimmy corrupts everything. I mean, even look at the Teletubbies. He calls them the Teletummies because it's also about how he remembers the thing. His entire dogma is built around this misremembered death of his father. You know, like, oh yeah, my dad is Satan because he thinks that's what he saw when he was 8 or however old he was. Jimmy's life-altering trauma, combined with the complete absence of guidance, allows him to freely build this twisted idea of purpose and growth. And we as an audience get to see how those childhood experiences get twisted into the man he is now. As a child, he watches Teletubbies, and when he's grown up, the group he forms is dressed in similar colors. And when it comes to the blonde wig, tracksuit, jewelry, and even the name, this is all a reference to Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was a public figure and philanthropist who hosted a kids' TV show titled Jim'll Fix It, where he would grant wishes for children, like taking them horse riding for the first time or even letting them be a post office package for the day. And as you could imagine, the show gave him a pretty admirable reputation with children across the UK, which is the same lasting impression he likely left on Jimmy Crystal before the outbreak when he was a little kid. However, as many may know in reality, and what Jimmy Crystal would never learn, is Jimmy Savile, after his death in 2011, was revealed to be one of the most infamous sexual predators in history, with hundreds of victims, including coworkers, children, and even hospital patients. This is just another symbolic parallel of evil grown from delusions of saviorship. But as Nia hinted earlier, it isn't only childhood media that Jimmy Crystal has corrupted. It's also the memory of his father. Jimmy's dad was a priest who he remembers to have believed the outbreak was a destined biblical event, embracing the virus that would inevitably infect him. And as we hear from Jimmy, the last he saw of his father was him leading a charge of the infected. And when you combine the idea of Jimmy distorting his childhood and the idea of Jimmy seeing his priest father lead a charge of zombies, it only makes sense that Jimmy would begin to believe his dad is the devil. It's all this combination of coping with a wildly traumatic childhood, finding purpose in a life of undeserved punishment, and reattaching yourself to a parental figure that you've lost in the most shocking and devastating way. And a lot of that purpose he's found is really completely made up. We see him telling stories of his own personal semi-biblical lore about being a savior, the right hand of Satan with 7 fingers to carry out his duty to torturously send souls to the devil, which he describes as charity. None of this is real. It's all something that he's just fabricated in his own mind. And as this film goes along, what we learn is even his beliefs in what he has created is deep down paper thin. And truly, he's depraved, empty, and lost. And this reality is most clearly revealed when he finally meets and converses with Dr. Kelson. There's this sad desperation in Jimmy's words as he describes losing his father and hearing the voice of the devil in his head to fill the void of that loss. And it's confirmed how paper thin his beliefs are when he blackmails Kelson into pretending he's the devil in order to convince his own team of Jimmys that he has really been called upon by Satan. If Jimmy's faith in his own religion was true and pure, he would never have felt the need to lie to his friends about his calling. It's all just a lie to himself, a lie to cope with the tragedy, evil, and misguidance that he's experienced. As Nia very succinctly explains, it's not about God or the devil, it's about dogma. And it's about people who twist things that are perhaps presented in good faith into something darker to suit their own sadistic means. And Jimmy's sense of destiny is so clearly based in fear. For example, we never see him carry out any of the gruesome work. He just directs from behind. And when you get a closer look at him, his face is completely free of any scars, unlike his 7 fingers who have clearly suffered scarification and brutal slashes to the face. And those 7-finger Jimmys are just as misguided and lost. During the torture scene, we can see that all of them in their reactions are either tired of it, sick from it, or numb to it. Especially Jimmy Inc., who feels the most numb and sick and tired of all of their satanic deeds. Unfortunately, Spike, as mentioned in the previous section, is a character designed to defy and escape social and mental conditioning. So he's the perfect inspiration for her to sense a way out. And from Kelson's perspective, he's perfectly aware of the fact that Jimmy Crystal is desperate and deluded. And what I think makes this most apparent is the song Kelson chooses for his performance for the Jimmys. The song Kelson performs is Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. And if you listen to the lyrics of the song, it perfectly represents Jimmy's phoniness. The lyrics in modern culture are often misunderstood as an endorsement for Satanism and devil worship. But really, it's a song about being trapped inside a nightmare and hallucination of evil, drawing heavily from not just religious horror cinema, but a feeling of moral panic and misguidance. Exactly what Jimmy is going through. And it's the finale of the film where, in all of its darkness and tragedy, it still offers another, even more glowing ray of hope. Jimmy Crystal's faith is dissolving before his eyes as we kind of hear him mutter that he can't hear the devil anymore. And he even asks, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" With this delusion of a devil-horned Samson walking away from him as he hangs upside down on this inverted cross that he's devoted his entire life to. And in reality, as Kelson is dying, we hear Samson say specifically the words, "Thank you," for all of the selflessness and empathy and care that's literally nursed him back to health. And in what I like to say is the epilogue of the film, or you could even say the precursor to the third film in the trilogy, we see Cillian Murphy's Jim finally return with a daughter that he presumably had with Selena from the first film, 28 Days Later. But just before this movie ends, what Jim tells his daughter just perfectly encapsulates everything this 28 Days film series has been trying to tell us so far. So Jim is helping his daughter study for a history exam, and what Jim references is World War I and World War II. He describes how the Allies were quite unforgiving after their victory in the First World War, leaving the losing countries in complete social and economic collapse. But such a harsh loss gave rise to a desire for vengeance that gave rise to World War II. So when the Allies won the second time, they were much more conciliatory, helping those losing countries in certain ways so they didn't completely collapse. And therefore, it would be less likely that history would repeat itself once more. And of course, the Allies are certainly not perfect heroes, to say the very least, but it's still that general concept of aiding even your enemy and dismantling destructive belief systems that is the central philosophy of the 28 Days series. Memento Mori is the only remedy to the world's vicious virus of rage. Alright, this is my analysis. As you can guess, I am a huge fan of the 28 Days Later film series, so of course this video was going to be as long as it is, so thank you so much for watching. And on that note, considering how many films there are that are so incredibly dense themselves, please let me know all of your insights and personal perspectives about any of the films. So again, thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to discuss, and I'll see you later.